No worries at all. Um, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Mohammed. It's an absolute pleasure doing this lecture today. As sort of the introduction presented, this is the seventh lecture of the lecture ring series. And today I'll be talking about from energy apartheid to environmental warfare, decolonizing climate justice in Palestine. I am Mohammed Usrof. I'm the executive director of the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, currently leading several campaigns on energy, on false climate solutions, and geoengineering. And today's presentation is going to be a huge debrief as well, considering that COP30 in Brazil just took place. So this is such a crucial moment in sort of our politics in the genocide, um, kind of moving forward, how um, things are developing, because the genocide is still ongoing. The ceasefire has been violated time and time again. And I think it's extremely crucial more than ever to understand how these violations and these political movements are very crucial to every other movement and every other locale and site of oppression, but how do we look at it from a site of morality and political clarity? So a lot of this presentation is going to reference the Climate Justice Manifesto that the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy has worked on, but also other documents and resources that we've worked on in collaboration with other partners, such as the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, as well as Oxfam International, among many other partners across Latin America, Asia, um, and the Americas. So let's begin. As I said briefly, the climate justice movement is part of the struggle. The reason that we as Palestinians look at climate and climate justice is part of the reason that we should mobilize with other movements and other sort of different locales. As I said, partially what's happening in Gaza is a microcosm of the world on fire. It's a mirror and a reflection of how systems of oppression are entrenched in our society. When we hear the calls of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, we understand how deeply connected what's happening in Palestine is to the global movement across the world. And we're talking about people from all walks of life. When it comes to what's happening in Palestine in terms of the weaponization of resources, land, water, air, and so on, we're also talking about the same patterns that we've seen experimented on in other countries. And we're talking about sort of what's happening right now in Venezuela. We're seeing how the media is portraying that conflict and how um, the need for extraction is slowly building up. And the same applies to how different um, movements, such as that in Colombia or even in South Africa, are currently heeding the cause of the BDS energy embargo, but also largely the people are demanding an energy embargo and the people are demanding boycotts of these different corporations and patterns of extraction and exclusion because of the fact that they are already harmful to people. So the point here is that what's happening in Palestine, from militarism to resource control to racializing inequality, colonialism, climate apartheid, etc., is a pattern that we've seen across the globe, and people are already reacting and acting on it. And it's just a matter of how do we then build on the mobilizations across the globe for Palestine with the other movements so that we are seen as a global connected movement and not acting in silos, because the crucial point here is that we all are more powerful together as people, united across the globe in different contexts against similar systems of oppression. So throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about energy apartheid, environmental warfare, and ecocide. We'll be talking about militarism and solar geoengineering and how all these different issues are extremely connected to other movements across the globe. So ultimately, the manifesto is also out, so feel free to read the manifesto for more information, but hopefully we'll be able to cover the core principles of the manifesto throughout the presentation. Um, I'll begin through the basic framework that green colonialism and generally unjust transitions has been a core theme in the dialogue around climate justice in the past few weeks and months, especially for in preparation for COP30, which just recently announced the Debilane action mechanism, or one of the key just transition sort of mechanisms, has been sort of put in the text. And the key point here is how does that influence what we do as Palestinians for the climate justice movement? So I just want to make sure, am I audible so far? Because I'm hearing some of the other panelists' mics on. Okay, I'm assuming all is good, so I'll proceed. So the Green Colonialism report that we worked on with Oxfam, or Unjust Transitions, looks at how clean energy repeats colonial patterns. We're talking about how clean energy or green hydrogen or green energy or whatever other sort of colonial context, whether it's the EU or the Moroccans or the Israeli government, how they all refer to these forms of transitions as part of their colonial conquest. In Morocco, renewable energy projects are taking place in the Western Sahara as a form of creation of consent or manufacturing of consent, but also of greenwashing colonial conquests. The same applies to Israel over the Syrian Golan Heights and also within the Palestinian territories when it comes to um, either carbon markets or even more recently with land grab legal systems. So the Israeli legal system, um, and I believe the late 70s under the Israeli minister at the time of agriculture had the law of the dead land, which allowed for the Israelis to take over Palestinian land even when it is completely Palestinian. Houses are built on it, agriculture is cultivated. And the key concept here is the fact that they would claim that um, it's not cultivated on just because of the dry seasons in which they would go out either through drones or satellite mapping and claiming that the land is dead and that allows for the Israelis to expand their territories on it. And that has allowed for colonial extraction and colonial conquest of Palestinian land over the last several decades. But more importantly, we're also going to look at how that has impacted Palestinians on the ground in the West Bank and also how these patterns are reflected in currently in Gaza. But most importantly, it's extremely crucial to remember that these forms of colonial patterns are seen across the globe. So even in the Amazonia, we've seen language of greenwashing used to take down forests and turn the environment into profit. The same applies to so-called America, so-called Canada. And it's extremely crucial to remember how these forms of colonialisms are happening in our sort of backyards or in their own countries. So it's extremely crucial to just remember that. And one of the key concepts here within the concept of green colonialism is energy infrastructure. So when we're talking about how these infrastructures of control allow for the greenwashing of it, it's also really important to understand how these infrastructures even begin to allow for inequalities. So I want to take us back to early 1920s when Israel wasn't created and Palestine was under the British mandate. Phineas Rutenberg, Russian Zionist, brought electricity to Palestine um, under the racial concept of um, creating racialized hierarchies. And at the time, colonialism was a trend, and colonialism is a global system of creating hierarchies that are racialized, creating racialized capitalism, creating other forms of capitalism and colonialism and extraction. And a lot of it would have to come at the expense of people. And the same way that we see capitalist structures today in our current world, in Germany and across the globe, based on these racialized hierarchies or even invisible forms of apartheid. So, more importantly, I'm talking about early 1920s. Electricity was introduced in Palestine, where 80% of electricity was provided to 20% of the people, and that were the Jews in Palestine. And then 20% of the electricity went to 80% of the population, and that was the Palestinians. Over time, with what we see here as the concept of petrocultures is the manifestation of these infrastructures and energy systems into our daily lives. So, how does our dependence on fossil fuels, especially at the time, or our dependence on electricity systems, impacting our forms of power dynamics or our forms of cultural values and cultural integration. So when we say that 20% of the population had most of the power and most of the energy, we're talking about a clear experiment of how a society could rise over the other society, creating that technological apartheid over time. So, um, more specifically, that was around 1923, and people revolted. People had forms of sabotage and forms of resistance. Boycotts were actually initiated back then. So we saw the first movement for boycotts back in the 1920s, where people boycotted that attempt for the Palestinian Electricity Corporation to co-opt the politics of the people and subscribe to that Zionist form of infrastructure. Over time, people resisted, people boycotted, and as time went by, pipelines and further oil infrastructures were created on Palestinian land. And we saw in 1936 how Palestinians resisted and sabotaged pipelines. So this idea of blowing up pipelines wasn't too far off. Palestinians blew up pipelines. There's a significant poem called Sarhan in the Pipeline, which talks about Sarhan al-Ali and how um, he was one of the first people who would sabotage the pipelines and how there were massive marches between Haifa and Jaffa all the way to Tulkarem and Nazareth. And these sort of marches and riots and protests were in retaliation to these systems developing and slowly creating that hierarchy and apartheid. And we saw how that developed later on in 1947 and 1948 with the Nakba. And this is all to say that these forms of energy transitions come at a colonial expense and come at or to the benefit of colonials or the sort of 1% even, because what we talk about in the energy transition report is how a just energy transition is meant to serve all people alike and how we're not meant to leave people behind. But when we're talking about an energy transition that is only meant to serve people over another, then we're creating hierarchies, whether we like it or not. And that's how oil transforms systems over time. And we're talking about the murder and the sort of murderous infrastructure that was created more than 100 years ago. So seeing a genocide ongoing in 2025 is another symptom of the injustices created and planted and rooted back then. So just a few questions that I would ask the audience, or just questions for people to think about, is what are the communities that you are ready to fight for? What are the communities that you have seen injustices set upon them? How have these injustices been placed, or how do they operate? Because we see, in the manifesto, we talk about how these forms of colonialism are sustained through different tools and weaponizations of society, whether that's, splitting the movement over mere issues of hierarchies, power dynamics. Even the patriarchy is a major system of oppression that people could relate to, or racism and so on. So looking at the situation in Palestine, even in the early 1920s or forever, we always have seen resistance. So the question is, how do you resist in your own context against the systems of oppression, and how do you connect your resistance to the resistance of those in Palestine? So those are some of the key questions that we as an organization have been asking the different groups and movements that we've worked with. And so far, it's been such a powerful exercise learning about how people resisting in Mexico, people resisting in Sweden, people resisting in Brazil is extremely connected to our struggle. And that takes me to the next slide, where we look at energy apartheid more specifically. When I'm talking about the climate justice movement, we talk about fossil fuels, we talk about fossil fuel corporations and big forms of exploitation of land. We've seen how Total, ExxonMobil, Shell, Eni, Dana, um, Chevron, and British Petroleum, among many other oil corporations, how they've all been complicit in genocide, but how they've all been complicit in climate collapse. This complete destruction of the environment, destruction of biodiversity in many lands, and the destruction of ecosystems is not a like an independent subject. It's not meant to be treated in a silo, but they're all extremely connected to the military industrial complex, to the media industrial complex. They all use the systems of oppression and the tools of oppression that I've talked about. Chevron has been working on their propaganda ever since its inception. Early on in the Middle East, it was the seven sister companies that had most of the monopoly over oil and gas, and we've seen how that developed to today's energy corporations. More specifically, in the context of the genocide in Palestine, we've seen how Petrobras, one of the Brazilian corporations that is partially owned by the state, and a lot of its profits goes to US imperialism and capitalism. People in Brazil started questioning why is their own resources being profited by the US and not by them. This key distinction of how do we think of our own resources? How do we think of our own sovereignty and agency is one of the more important questions that we should ask ourselves when we're thinking about our climate justice struggle and our climate justice movement. But more importantly, it's extremely crucial to think about how does our oil and gas and our fight for climate justice coincide with that in Nigeria, with that in South Africa, in Colombia, and in Palestine. In this case, we're looking at how Brazil fuels genocide and how Brazil has been circumventing the supply chains of genocide and complicity by sending its Brazilian oil to Italy. As we see in 2024, Brazil used to export $215 million in fuels to Israel. That is over 2.7 million barrels of crude oil. That is completely over 9% of its oil imports that feed the Haifa and Ashdod refineries. We've seen forms of complicity across Brazil, but even in the European Union and especially in Germany. And we're going to talk about that later on, especially when we look at the military emissions and specifically talking about climate reparations. But more importantly here, this is a really important case to look at because in the case of energy apartheid and the case of Brazil specifically, we're seeing how Petrobras is profiting and how they continue to hide behind the intermediaries, but also more importantly, how the unions and how the people have reacted. The people, as I said, are completely dissatisfied with the idea that their money and their resources is going to US imperialism, but not just that, but is going to Israel's war machine to fund its genocide and to fuel the genocide. So the workers have shown us how a just energy transition looks like. And a just energy transition is meant to give power to the people and voices to the local people and the unions and the dock workers. So what happened was that the Italian dock workers and the Brazilian oil unions have all blocked ships in their own contexts so that Israel wouldn't be able to continue its imports. And as I said, when Brazil circumvented that form of power to Italy, so sending the oil to the Italian refineries, specifically looking at Saras SPA or even looking at Valero in Texas, we're seeing how they've circumvented that, and that route needs to be continued to be resisted against, and unions need to continue working against that. And we've seen how Italian unions, such as the USB or Cobas, continue to resist. And we currently have a big push in a week from now in Italy to have the unions go out to the docks and resist against the oil regime. So we're also pushing for the campaign of no drop of Brazilian oil to Israel, which makes the COP30 that we were just at a very crucial point in time. As I said, we were working with the unions of oil workers, and we recently came out with an investigation. So we, in throughout a lot of our work, the goal is to ensure that we raise awareness and we build consensus about the climate justice movement and about how to politicize it and how to decolonize it, ensuring that we build power for all and we resist against imperialism together because otherwise we cannot work in silos. So, and the same applies to our work in Colombia and how Colombia itself was pioneering in its resistance, pushing for an energy embargo, and even more importantly, recently completely cutting their complicity with Israel. Um, so that's really mostly it, how Brazil was one of the cases of displaying a core political demand of no oil for genocide, and Colombia being also another example of a successful campaign to completely cut oil and gas and coal to Israel. But I think more importantly now, there needs to be more pressure against Turkey, against Kazakhstan, against South Africa to ensure that the climate justice movement is holding itself accountable to the principles that it holds. We cannot have fossil fuels or oil or gas or coal that contributes to genocide or contributes to the climate collapse and environmental doom. So that brings us to the next point of how do these movements largely affect the ongoing situation in Palestine. When we're talking about environmental warfare, especially in Gaza, we're talking about the genocide's impact thus far. We're talking about 42 million tons of rubble that currently are in Gaza. And the key issue is how does that even begin to be cleaned up, and how do we even allow for Palestinians to even think of their own form of sovereignty and capacity building to allow for such a response, assuming that the genocide is over, which it is not. So that systematic destruction of infrastructure completely debilitates any form of um, social and political mobilization, let alone any form of development. And that is why Gaza is a well-known case to be in de-development. So this concept of de-development is exactly used for the case of Gaza, where Gaza has completely, for the past 17 years, been in a state of a blockade and a siege, but also continuous warfare, where that siege has not allowed for any form of tools, and even in terms of food and resources being completely blocked out. So we have seen how through the Rafah border, Gaza completely um, doesn't get any form of resources. And so far, eggs and wheat and baby formula, as well as basic winter clothing, because winter is coming in Gaza, is not delivered and actually comes at such a high cost, especially recently, considering that they've eased up the situation. But we see how um, eggs cost at least $15, how flour costs hundreds of dollars, and how baby formula comes to Palestine in its expired state. So that is partially from the environmental side of things, but more importantly, we have to see the reality on the ground from a gendered lens. So we have conducted several reports and interviews with Palestinian women in Gaza, and it's extremely crucial to remember that in the case of the development, we must see how Palestinian women suffer the most of the occupation infrastructure demolition. We're talking about how Palestinian women have the burden of queuing for unsafe water, how they have to suffer the burden of providing for the family, even when the family doesn't have any form of resources or food, or even to take care of her children or babies. So we're looking at how they become key actors against genocide, showing a form of resistance. But from an environmental lens, it's extremely crucial to remember how unsafe waters, unsafe air, and complete lack of infrastructure contributes to the family dynamics. So these emissions and environmental harms in general in Palestine are not just a matter of climate numbers and quantitative facts, but it's really crucial to remember that if the family doesn't have what it needs to provide for itself, then people collapse, even if there's no destruction, continuous warfare by Israel. Palestinians now have to suffer the burden of how do you even begin to rebuild or think of reconstruction, and especially when we're talking about a genocidal regime that recently secured a plan under Trump and under the Tony Blair Institute to have complete foreign intervention in its own reconstruction. So that completely takes away the agency of Palestinians. And it's extremely crucial to also remember that this is not new at all. Apartheid and occupation and the violation of consent and the violation of our land, making it completely uninhabitable, is a pattern seen in both Gaza and the West Bank for as long as Zionists have been in Palestine. Um, just to take this to the next sort of part of the presentation, we're talking about the case of Auda Hadalin, who um, was from the village of Khair in the South Hebron Hills. Auda was a environmental land defender. He was a father of three and a long-time community educator, and Auda plays a significant role in understanding how settler violence can be resisted against, but also how completely unlawful and how completely difficult it is to resist because we're talking about land in Area C, but even in Area A and B in the West Bank, Palestinians continue to suffer from any form of settler expansion. And that settler violence and expansionist ideology comes at a heavy cost where a lot of it is unlawful and a lot of it is unprovoked and a lot of it comes at such um, a low point in which they would either attack Palestinian families during the night or ensure that they cannot yield the crops of this year. And we're talking about the olive harvest specifically in this season. So the olive harvest, we've been working with colleagues in Palestine who are meant to be able to harvest their olive yields this year, but they've not been able to due to the continuous and consistent attacks on Palestinian families and Palestinian houses. So far in the village of Masafir Palestinians have had to, in Masafir in al Khair specifically, they've seen 14 demolition orders and the complete destruction of water systems and water infrastructure, as well as the destruction of other houses and libraries and schools. Um, this is a form of environmental warfare, if anything, because it completely debilitates a society's way of living and heritage and memory of the land. This complete erasure of infrastructure and erasure of Palestinian heritage is completely a form of apartheid and green colonialism and environmental warfare. And Auda was a key driver of resistance in the family, where more than 60 women have gone on a hunger strike after his death. And his death came extremely unprovoked by a settler who attacked the village, thinking that he owns the village, and shot Auda in the chest while he and his family were defending his home. Um, so it's extremely crucial to just remember how his death is a form of resistance, and how the the family's reaction after was also a form of resistance. And this is one just case out of the case of many Palestinians across history, and even more recently in the genocide. Every case in Palestine, specifically in Gaza during the genocide, has been a case of leadership as well as resistance and environmental justice, where people are trying to defend their land. So I'll move on to the sort of next point, which is how does this connect to the larger international climate movement? Because we're talking about people, we're talking about the realities on the ground, we're talking about its connection to the environmental justice movement. But then, more crucially, how does this connect to other forms of green colonialism? And we're talking about weather manipulation and solar geoengineering. In Palestine, recently as well, a company called Stardust Solutions, that is a US Israeli company, began its experimentation in the Palestinian territories, where now they've begun conducting atmospheric tests during the genocide that links its work to the intelligence and the military networks. And we're talking about a company that is currently funded by the IDF and also has on its board of directors former FBI, former Mossad, former CIA, and former MI5 agents who have been complicit in the genocide and the occupation of Palestinians for millennia. So the point is, why are they now contributing to this false climate solutions or a solar geoengineering company or product? And the answer is simple. There's a dual usage of it, and we see how crucial it is to the climate movement, because any form of solar geoengineering or solar radiation management is essentially harmful. Because for those who don't know much about SRM is a technology that shifts rainfall, alters seasons, and reflects sunlight by putting out stratospheric aerosols to the air so that sunlight is not coming to Earth as much as it should, as in it would disperse it, and that would then create a layer of coverage over our planet. And once the experiments start, there's no ending to the experiments, because then you have overshoot where our temperatures would go above and beyond normal levels, um, and that just creates complete impending climate doom. So the key issue here to remember is how solar geoengineering in this case has been used as an instrument of war, and this is not the first time. Weather modification technologies are banned and have been used even in the Vietnam US War in the 1970s, 80s, and they've been banned in the 1980s, and it's really crucial to bring back the attention to such technologies because we need to remember how this is a geopolitical question of technology, how AI is already monopolized, how surveillance technologies are already monopolized, how our digital cloud, whether it's on Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, is all controlled by some of the key and richest people in the globe. So, seeing this technology also being led by the US and Israel is another example of how there's a complete geopolitical monopoly and intention and violation of consent and land in that whole struggle, in that whole journey or experiment. Some of the key concerning issues is that this is already starting. So, PICS, or the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, had an investigation earlier this year, and we found out that they started experimenting indoors because there are two different forms of experiments, indoor experiments and outdoor experiments. And indoor experiments are are less dangerous because they happen at a controlled state. But when we're talking about complete deployment of these satellites or particles, or um, they've used fleets of planes in the past. They've used balloons, hot air balloons in the past to disperse these um, particles. So I think it's extremely important to just recall the fact that there are outdoor experiments happening, and we found out 2 weeks ago, if not a week ago. And now we are trying to push and have a campaign on how do you mobilize against such a global power, against such dangerous technologies, how to avoid their timeline, which is a timeline of ensuring that there's outdoor experiments happening in early 2026, how there must be demonstrations of temperature reduction by 2027, and how they want to have hundreds of planes pushing these aerosols over Palestine and across the global south by 2035. If we don't react in, or if we don't act proactively instead of reacting defensively, then we're not going to be able to see an end to such warfare over our skies and land. And this brings me to one of my last key points, which is how do you then understand this struggle from your own perspective, and especially within your own movement? The climate justice struggle is extremely interconnected to all forms of struggle. We're talking so far about extractivism, about colonialism, about conquest, and about militarization. Um, and I just wish to hold on here for a second because um, one of the key concepts is militarism in this case. We're seeing how entrenched the military industrial complex is in this specific situation of solar geoengineering and green colonialism, but we cannot forget the fact that the military industrial complex is itself complicit and is itself profiting from the genocide in Palestine. And that has been a consistent pattern across the last several decades in Palestine. In this case, we see how in the case of Palestine, currently we see a complete form of power building up through these climate technologies, how they've begun youth washing and greenwashing within their own contexts. Um, Currently, there's the conference in Kenya, Nairobi next week. That is UNIA 7, that will be looking at a de facto moratorium that is meant to uphold a basic form of governance over geoengineering, and it's extremely crucial to remember who will be lobbying for these technologies. So, as I said, it's the fossil fuel lobbyists in COP and at UNIA, but also the military industrial complex and their lobbying, which continues. And the same way backwards, because solar geoengineering technologies have their own consultants and lobbies within different governments. Because as I said, this is a geopolitical issue, and the more it develops, we'll see more lobbyists within Congress and within other governments, agencies that try to push for this technology. So having the US Congress approving for such technologies is going to cause a complete tension within global powers, and that means that other countries such as India, China, Russia would also begin to develop their own technologies, becoming more of an arms race, and we're talking about a false climate solution. So it's extremely simple to see how these technologies can become a race and also can become a contestation of power over people. Another key subject to remember is that um, under the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, in collaboration with Tipping Point, we came out with a report that talks about the figures as well as the measurable impact of the military and conflict-related emissions and climate reparations in Palestine during the genocide. And that came out during the global September climate mobilizations and ahead of COP30 in Belém. And the key findings of the report showed us that Germany is complicit by up to $3 billion in reparation to give to the Palestinians. And this is since the Nakba. It's not a huge number because this is simply from the military emissions and the conflict-related emissions, besides the fact that we're talking about larger reparation frameworks that would amount to hundreds of billions, if not much more. Israel is responsible for $103 billion, and the US is responsible for $40.8 billion. Generally, there's a huge push to ensure that demilitarization is one of the core demands of the climate justice movement. And I think for when we're looking at geoengineering as well, we're talking about how geoengineering is a form of green militarism and a greenwashing of that emission number. So it's crucial to remember how these technologies and how militarism is used as a form of control, and how there are campaigns that are attempting to greenwash the military as a way of making sure that killing people is normal. And it's a crucial message to the movement to remember how we must not radicalize what is, how we must not normalize what is radical, how we must not normalize exploitation and extractivism and the establishment of global hierarchies, and remember that what should not be forgotten is how we need to normalize the radical and normalize the peace processes that we need to push for as people, and normalize this idea that we must unite as people and as movements against global powers. Um, so lastly, when it comes to the climate justice movement, we came out with this manifesto that comes under three key messages. One is the recognition of most of the points that I made on the foundations of the struggle. So that being fossil capitalism, turning energy and fossil fuels into profit and allowing for systems to extract and exploit. We're talking about colonialism, the complete form of land theft and land grabs and killing of people across different land and geographies, and then also militarism and the climate ecological crisis and its interconnection to different struggles. The second is resistance. How do you resist by rejecting complicity? How do you resist the fossil fuel infrastructure? How do you resist the arms trade and techno solutions? And how do you build collective power as people? And then lastly, in the manifesto, we look at how do you rebuild, how do you build sovereignty, how do you build systems of care and economies of care, so that we can think about a future rooted in justice of ecological restoration, reparation, and sovereignty for the original people of the land. So this is the key sort of three principles that, or sort of parts of the journey that would allow us to decolonize climate justice, and how decolonizing climate justice is not meant to be an optional requirement in the struggle against fossil fuels, but rather it is central. And it's not, again, about reducing emissions, but about dismantling the core systems of occupation, extraction, and domination. It is about looking at the core principles or values that we believe in as a society that are potentially rooted in a form of fossil fuels or petroculture, and how we must think about a different way of life in order to actually completely resist and to de-link from these forms of colonial and capitalist economies that will sustain a racialized hierarchy, that will sustain harm to the land and the environment. So the key core to action for us as Palestinians is that the struggle is global. The struggle is connected from Palestine to the global south, how fossil warfare and is connected to a future that is green, that is sustainable, that is peaceful. So we ask that you join the movement that is anti-extractivist, looking at the cases in Africa, in Tunisia. People are resisting daily against green hydrogen projects, and the same applies by the indigenous people in Latin America and so-called North America. Um, and before I end, I just want to sort of end it on the note that the Palestinian non-negotiable right to return must always be in the heart and center in the core and center of our work. Indigenous people need to return to the land. Otherwise, whose climate and whose land are we talking about in our struggle for climate justice? Indigenous people need to be at the center of our work. We must begin to name ecocide and land devastation as a war crime and as a key principle of environmental justice. How we must work together as global movements to connect this struggle to broader struggles. So when we see forms of inequalities and injustices in Germany, it's extremely crucial to remember how they're connected to the way that these struggles are connected to, for example, how the IDF trains its soldiers, or how the IDF has had soldiers coming from Germany, or how systems of oppression have been implemented in Palestine as an experiment, because Palestine has been a laboratory of experiments and a laboratory of oppression. And we've seen that all the way from the Oranges in Ireland, how they've been sent to Palestine to lead or to develop or to train the IDF or early forms of the IDF, and the same applies to how um, India and Israel are currently building together forms of military and technological partnerships. So the key struggle here is to think about how our movements in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in India are connected to those in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in South Africa, to that of Palestine. And I think more importantly than ever, we need to see the complicity in our own governments and the complicity of our own communities and ensure that we're breaking free from that complicity and making sure that we're mobilizing and proactively working together against our local injustices and local forms of struggle for a better future for ourselves and for those in Palestine. So I wanted to stop here and just see if there are any questions before we, um, yeah, just continue in case there's any sort of inclination or anything that I should look more into. But thank you all. And yeah, I believe we have 10 more minutes, so I'm unsure if we could have a round of questions, especially because I'm seeing that the chat is sending a few things.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. We're gonna gather a few questions. And then while we ask the questions, we'd like to ask you to turn off your microphone. Otherwise, yeah, it's gonna be a bit of background noise in the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've gathered a few questions on Zoom or questions that reached us via mail. So one of them is, I don't know if you can answer that one, but we can try. You've talked about research your institute did on Stardust Solutions conducting covert atmospheric tests in Gaza. From an activist point of view, how does one find out this kind of information? Feel free to also not share, but yeah.
No, of course, that's a really important question. So the key call to action to a lot of activists, or actually one of the ways that activists should hear about information, is about socializing really important work and about making sure that trustworthy sort of news sources um, and sort of institutes and projects are put on your radar always. So that means getting your information from the right place. And in this case, Stardust Solutions is, as I said, something that this escalation came out 5 days ago. And we came out with a press release on our website that you can find on our website at palclimateinstitute.org. In the media section, you can just see it on the homepage as well. That has all the sources and all the information. It came out 5 days ago in an article by Politico, and we have a meeting with Politico in 2 days from now to learn more about their investigation and their intention in releasing that information and in how they got that information to ensure that is there more to that. The second thing is that there should be a huge climate justice push. Germany is one of the countries that is actually pioneering and or at least pushing on anti-geoengineering activities. So they have a good position on that, and we're already getting in touch with several actors and movements on how to mobilize for this. If you are an organization or a civil society movement or a body that wishes to discuss this and work on this, disseminate it through zines, publications, articles, videos, Instagram reels, etc., then feel free to reach out. We're doing a big narrative push and a big social media campaign in the next few weeks. So hopefully that answers your question. And I'm sorry that this didn't get on your media sooner.
It does answer the question. Thank you very much. I'll have a quick view in the lecture hall whether there are any questions live. Doesn't look like it, but we have a few more on Zoom, so that doesn't matter. The next question would be, how does the gendered experience and resistance of women in Gaza challenge mainstream and often gender-neutral climate justice narratives? Can you elaborate on that topic a bit more?
Okay, just so I understood correctly, the question is how does the gendered perspective contest with the gender neutral perspective?
Yeah, in the way I understood it was in mainstream media, the climate justice narratives are often gender neutral. What are your thoughts? How do they?
Got it. Yeah, I think it's extremely crucial to remember the gendered lens when it comes to our struggle for environmental justice. As I said, there are key intersections to development and military and all forms of different realities of occupation. And the gendered environmental reality is one of the most crucial. From the testimonies we've heard of Palestinian women, sorry, from the testimonies we've heard of Palestinian women, we've understood the connection to food and sovereignty, to ways of farming and agriculture, and also to the ways that they would raise a family and treat and sort of try to provide support to the family and the basic infrastructure. And that is all connected to the environmental reality. So when we're talking about a gender neutral environmental reality, we're talking about just an incomplete image or an incomplete picture of how environmental injustice is perceived. So, to answer the question just more directly, to not have a full picture of environmental injustice is to completely ignore other important aspects and realities of people on the ground. So, it's extremely crucial to have a full picture of the reality and of the situation, and that ensures that gender is one of the key concepts besides the other aspects that are part of the just transition discourse, for example, but also of the climate justice movement and also of any other movement. So, yeah, and happy to learn more if there are contestations between a gender neutral versus a gendered movement. But I think so far, um, the clarifying point is that gender is just an element out of many that should be taken into consideration.
Yes, thank you. I think that clarifies a few things. I'm going to give the job of asking questions to my colleague Sammy now, but we have a few more.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Thank you again. I have a question myself. I read in your slides this about fossil fuel dependency not being only about machines, but also about culture and power and values. And I wanted to ask you on inputs on how we can, as individuals, like start deconstructing these anchored culture aspects of it, especially from a Germany's point of view, from a global north country. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a really crucial question. And as I said, it all goes back to the key concept of petrocultures, which is a form of energy humanities. It's a field that is looked at by different scholars such as Imre Sisman, as well as a study by a Canadian group called After Oil. The reason I'm mentioning these resources is because they try to build a full picture as to how the world would look like after oil and what are the key issues needed or key things needed to get to that future free of oil, and not just free of oil, but also in a just and principled and a feminist manner. So we're looking at resisting through principle. We're looking at shifting our own way of thinking and shifting the way we live. And we're talking about the key ways of living. We're talking about the way that we eat. So I'm a political vegan. I avoid plastics. I avoid heavy meat, industrial food substance, just to be aware of my own consumption, because I know that my complicity in consuming other products, whether it's just simply being plastic wrapped or simply also being under Nestle or Pepsi and Cola and so on, is contributing to that larger petroculture and larger fossil fuel system. In Germany, we're talking about considering that it's a walkable city, but also generally being used as a logistics hub for fossil fuel supply chains and also still remaining to be a fossil capitalist structure. We're talking about its complicity in militarism and its complicity in surveillance and policing. And I think as Germans, the key way to achieve an after oil that is principled in justice, values of justice, is to resist the key policing and to resist um, the main struggles through a principled approach. So that means also working with the movement and defining what those principles are and ensuring that those same principles you're resisting injustices in are the same principles you want to rebuild after the injustice. So when we're talking about a petroculture and a fossil fuel system, even if it wasn't fossil fuels, and even if it wasn't oil and gas, and assuming it was renewable energy and whatever, if we have the same ways of living that is dependent on cars and dependent on plastics and dependent on supply chains that have logics and logistics of imperialism and evil, then we're not really resisting the system. We still live in the same system of imperialism, just more greenwashed or just more green. So it's about realizing the system that you live in and just remembering that this is a core principal issue, that the world that we live in is structurally Zionist and structurally imperial and structurally capitalist. So we're talking about German companies, German banks, pension funds, insurance finance, German politics even, that is rooted in racial capitalism, that is rooted in the tools of oppression that we talked about. And yeah, I think as Germans, it's just about how to reconstruct a vision of the future. So a lot of this is political imaginaries work. A lot of it is how do you imagine a future? And I think we don't have a vision of the future that is actually just, all of the activists that I know, and even myself, I struggle to fully realize a world where, sure, Zionism can be rid of, but also even if Zionism is not there, or even if Israel doesn't exist, or even if genocide ends, how could we even think of a future together as people where we have our sovereignty, or how do we reclaim our sovereignty? And I think that idea of solidarity across borders is crucial. So I would start by talking to people about what is the vision of a future that we want to create. How do we even begin to sustain ourselves and our bodies and our communities in a degrowth fashion, in a fashion where it's not always about winning or successfully achieving land or bringing more resources or productivity and efficiency. It's about rebuilding the system that we live in through care and love and mutual aid and support beyond borders, beyond resources, beyond imperialism.
Thank you very much for this beautiful, positive um, answer. I admire that to stay imagining this future. And now I'm gonna read another question from our Zoom, and it's what alternatives exist to ensure that energy transition does not simply become a shift from fossil colonialism to green colonialism? Thank you.
Yeah. So to ensure that, so it's very similar to the same question asked before, just very different focuses. is how do we break free from the system? So the system has symptoms of evil and injustice implemented in it. So when we were talking about about the unjust transitions or a transition of energy and generally societies, if we don't change the key principles of how we approach our life, then they're going to be in the same kind of tones of evil and injustice. So I think more crucially, it's important to remember how can we rebuild from below? How can we transition from fossil fuels to other alternative energies from below and not from corporations and not from governments? So, and that could mean in Germany, so shifting from an extractive green transition to community-owned renewables, to public energy infrastructures, avoiding privatized utilities, from building municipality climate assemblies that include refugee and migrant communities. Another principle of that is to ensure that Palestine is not a taboo in German politics and is also spoken about as an example of complicity and an example of how supporting Israel has been a weaponization of guilt and a weaponization of history within the German politics, as well as, just looking at the transition as a reparative transition and not a transition of addition. We've seen how in the past 200 years how every form of transition from one energy source to another has been in transition has been an addition and not a substitution. We've been adding more of our consumption. It's always been a consumption of more and more and more power and never a full transition or a substitution. When we went from wood and biofuels to coal and gas and oil, it's always been an addition. And you can see the spreadsheet, the graphs in general, how our consumption increases. So it's never about an individualized experience of how we consume. It's just been an idea of how do we perceive the production of the world, and it's always a production of more, and a logic of efficiency, a logic of productivity, a logic of consumption that just steals from the world, assuming that the energy sources that we have are infinite, except that they're very much finite and distributed unequally. So I'm just really laying out here the key like facts of the matter, and is that we are all complicit in this system because of how we see things. So as long as we continue seeing the energy source that we have at home to be infinite, then we're just never going to actually break free. And even if we are privileged enough to have water and electricity and live in community, it's really important not to forget the people that we leave behind, the people whose electricity we've stolen so that we have full 24 hours of electricity. Because many huge numbers of people in the world suffer from energy poverty, suffer from food poverty and poverty in general, even in Germany and even in every other country. So again, this is not to say that Germany is the only country complicit, but every individual across the globe is complicit in one way or the other. And it's really crucial to begin to think, how does our movement represent these injustices and how do we break free from them? How do we break free from chains of complicity? So, yeah, and a lot of this is the work that Francesca Albanese has put out, but also the work that a lot of Palestinian groups are trying to push out to show that this is our way of sovereignty, this is our way of rebuilding life. So, yeah, I'm just gonna end it with one key message, and it's just to value life, to value humanity, and to ensure that your humanity doesn't come at the cost of another human. We're all equally human, and I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we still have two more questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, how would global climate policy change if military emissions and war infrastructures were treated as a central rather than a marginal? How do you imagine COP and international politics if this were the case?
If demilitarization was a central topic. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. So currently, the military emissions account for over 5%, nearly 6% of global emissions, and a lot of it is unreported. So it's probably much, much more. Even in the recently nationally determined contributions, countries don't talk about militarization as one of their key statistics and key numbers. And instead, they would blame the corporations for it or not even include it as part of the key issue. So we're talking here about both military emissions, as in greenhouse gas emissions emitted from wars and genocides, but also we're talking about major budgets and finances that should go to these efforts of restoration and regenerative economies, restoration, building infrastructure for people, and instead it goes to killing people. And in general, it is part of a profit-making system to these corporations as well as governments that sell weapons, that being the US and Israel. So what's needed here is to have a climate negotiation sort of conference or policies that are rooted in a mandatory disclosure of military emissions, where we're able to discuss the reallocation of military budgets to climate finance, especially in this case. And that has been a core um, issue in this COP and the previous COPs. We're talking about, we sit on the same tables, negotiation tables, as countries that are completely going extinct because of climate change. We're talking about Fiji, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Kiribati, and then also countries in the Caribbean, and largely even in the world, we've seen hurricanes and floods and tsunamis that have impacted a lot of communities. So this issue of military emissions should be central to every country and not just to Palestinians because of the ongoing genocide. So, and should be really everybody's problem because of the complicity of most countries as well. And then largely, I think there should be a complete ban of fossil arms and apartheid-linked corporations from the UNFCCC. And this year, we had a big push on kicking Israel out, and Israel was not present anyway at the UNFCCC. So this push to kick Israel out and to kick other complicit corporations from COP and from the climate negotiation process is extremely crucial. Because why is it that out of I think every 25 delegate at the UN, there's one fossil fuel lobbyist? That's a big number. Ultimately, when we're looking at the larger conference, it's a huge number because even in the room that you're in, there's probably one or two fossil fuel lobbyists if you were at a UN conference, and that's a dangerous precedent to set because how are we going to negotiate for a better climate free from fossil fuels when we have people making deals on indigenous people lands in the Amazon and also profiting from it and also making sure that we're killing people and leaving people behind for profit. So yeah, it's a major ideological shift, believe it or not, the fact that we cannot and should not kill people and we should not leave people behind. But this is the state of the world right now, and hopefully this continuous push on demilitarization from every country and every movement is essential. And as I said, it's not seen in the nationally determined contributions, and they should be. And that's a good start. That's a good start to think about how does your own government represent these numbers and this complicity on paper and in policy.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very thankful as a person that comes from Venezuela, which is at the Caribbean and also completely dependent on oil. I really appreciate your point of view. And now to wrap up, I'm gonna ask a question to to come back to this positive shift at the end. And it's what still gives you hope in view of the climate crisis?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And as I said, what gives me hope in the climate justice movement is how climate justice is an issue of really livelihood in general. In Ireland, climate justice is a housing crisis issue. In Palestine, climate justice is an anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist issue. In in sort of many other countries in the Amazonia, climate justice is a deforestation issue. And what gives me hope is that when we talk about climate justice and when we talk about this huge movement, as people coming together against these different oppressions, it's really important for me to remember that my fight is another person's fight and we're working on this together. So that gives me a lot of hope and makes sure that I'm always feeling an impact and feeling just really gratitude that other people are also pushing for their own survival. And I think this valuing of humanity and valuing of survival and valuing of life is what makes me feel that our work is important. Now, how do I feel hopeful about avoiding the climate crisis and making sure that, generations to come get to live on the same land that we lived on? Is a question that, as I said, I think it's just a matter of building hope together and building a vision where we can still see that. And there is still potential for that more than ever. We cannot go back in time, but we can make sure that we don't keep making the same mistakes in the future. And it's really important to use our voices and build communities that are able to hold those in power accountable. And if not, then we build our own power and we resist. Palestinians have resisted, people in Colombia have resisted, people in South Africa and Italy, people all over have resisted, people in Venezuela are currently resisting US imperialism. And it's important to build on that and make sure that the worst doesn't happen. As I said early on in the campaign for false climate solutions, we cannot take a victim mindset and defend ourselves just simply by taking the blow. We should proactively mobilize against the atrocities that we know are coming. So we cannot wait for 2026 and 2030 and 2050, where we talk about net zero, assuming that net zero means a climate just world. On the contrary, it just means they're going to greenwash other forms of imperialism until we reach impending doom, and we cannot allow that. So, just last words is that we must build power together and resist together and build communities transboundary through different borders, through different boundaries, and ensure that our movement through the self-determination movement and the Palestinian movement, the feminist movement, and the climate movement, among many other struggles and movements, are working together for the same goal, in hopes for a free and a liberated world and a vision of free people of the world working together, under regenerative economies of care and a future for our children and our generations and ourselves. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much for those very beautiful words. And yes, I think that was all. I wish you a lot of luck and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Bye. Dankeschön.
Tut uns leid für die technischen Probleme.